So now we're going to look at a different topic. We are going to look at how to write unit tests for your API project. We are going to continue with our orders project, and we will see how to implement some tests for it. So I'm going to ask you to go to version 0.7 of our API project. So I'm going to do it here, check out 0.7. So I have implemented a small unit testing framework here that we are going to use for our tests. Let's take a look. I have a tests.py, and here I have a test case. I'm using the unit test package from the Python standard library. So I'm going to use the Flask test client for these tests. The Flask client is nice because it allows me to send requests into the application, and it works in a very similar way to our HTTP client that we've been using from the command line to test the API manually. But one problem that the test client has is that it is generic. It's designed to work with traditional web applications as well as APIs. So there are a number of things that need to be specified. So for example, if I want to send a request for an API, I will have to tell it that I want JSON data in and out, that I want to authenticate, and it gets troublesome to have to do that every time I need to send a request in a test. So what I did is I created a wrapper for the test client, and I'm using that instead. So let me show you. This is in a separate module, and I called it testclient.py. So this is a class that wraps the Flask test client, and it provides API-friendly features so that I don't have to do this every time. So let's see. When we look at the constructor, here I'm sending a username and a password, and this overloaded client will store the username and password in the form that is sent in a request. So this is going to be the authorization header that will be sent with requests. And this client will add this authentication for me every time, so I don't have to worry about it. Here you see a generic send function. This is the function that sends a request. And here I'm going to send the URL, the method that I'm going to use, the data that I want to send, and the headers if there are any that are non-standard. So I'm going to use this method to send requests into the API. So you can see that here I do some processing with the URLs and the headers, then with the data, and then when I'm ready to send the request, I create a test request context, and this is what enables the test client from Flask to be activated. And then I send that request by calling the same functions that Flask calls every time it handles a request for real. So I'm going to do the preprocess request, dispatch, I make a response, process the response, and then at the end I'm going to return the response object from the route. And as a handy feature, I'm also going to return the JSON data, if there was any, that's ready decoded into a Python dictionary. Now, send is a generic method. I don't really want to use that. I want to have specific methods for the get, the post, put, and the delete. So here I have these 4 specific ones that invoke send with the correct arguments. And you can see, for example, in the GET request, since there is no data to send, I do not have data here, but I do have it in the post and the put. So this is very convenient and allows me to write tests using a very simple syntax. So let's see how the tests are written. Here I have a test case. This is created using the Python unit test package from the standard library, and I have my default username and password. These are the ones I'm going to use when I send a request, so that I don't have to send them every time by hand. I have them stored here as class variables. In my test case setup function, I'm going to set up the environment for my tests. And here I store my application and create an application context, I push the context. This is so that I then can access my database. Now my database will be tied to the application, and I can drop my tables and then recreate them so that I go to a known state. This is going to be a completely empty database. I create a user, set the password, and then add it to the database. And now I have a user that I can use when I authenticate my test requests. Finally, I get an instance of my overloaded test client, and I pass as username. This is the username argument. I pass a token. This is a valid token that I request from my user. And then as password, I pass an empty string because there's no need when we do token authentication. So now this test client is already set up to send requests into the API. The token has been generated and we are ready to go. So let's look at the test. Here's a test that exercises the customer's resource. So you can see here that I commented the little sections that do different things. So I start by getting a list of customers. So I send a GET request to customers slash or slash customers slash. I get a response. I need to make sure that the status code of that response is 200. And then from the JSON, I can ensure that I get an empty list. This should always be empty because I cleaned up the database in my setup. So now I'm going to send a post request to add a customer. So self.client.post, it goes to slash customer slash, same URL. And here I send my data. And see how easy it is here because my overloaded test client takes care of handling the JSON conversion. So here I just send the dictionary. And I send name set to John. This in the HTTP client in the command line, it will be name equals John. You saw me do this in the demonstrations. So this response needs to return 201. And then I need to make sure that I've got a location. So I capture the header from the response, store it in a local variable. And then right away I go and try to send a GET request to that location. And I make sure that I get 200. I make sure that the JSON data that came back is John, it matches the resource that I set. And I then make sure that when I get my customer list, I still get a 200. And now when I look at my customer list, I have one element, and that one element matches the location that I capture from my new resource. Then I keep going, and I can exercise the put method, and I can send the put request to the location that I captured. This is the location of the one resource that I have. And now I change the name to John Smith, make sure that I get a 200. Then I get the resource again, and still needs to be 200, but now the name needs to be the new name. So as you can see here, I exercised a good deal of the API, all the methods for the customers. And then the only thing that remains is in the tier down. I basically undo what I did to create the environment in setup. So I destroy my database session, drop all my tables, and pop my application context. So we can run this as a script, and when this runs, there's one test. It was successful, and it took a quarter of a second to run. In the next video, we are going to see how to improve this, because now it's really unclear how effective my test is. We don't really know if this is a good testing strategy or not. So next video, we're going to look at test coverage and learn how to create effective tests.